Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. With major funding from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, helping to build a more just world. And additional funding from the Park Foundation, committed to raising public awareness.
Tonight on Frontline, the battle over the power of the presidency and a new way of looking at the Constitution.
They believed that the president could do as he liked, even if Congress, even if the Supreme Court said he couldn't.
For 3 decades, Vice President Dick Cheney led a secretive and bitter behind-closed-doors battle to restore presidential power.
He believes that the president should have the final word, indeed the only word, on all matters within the executive branch.
After 9/11, there were enhanced presidential powers to detain, render, interrogate, wiretap.
Mr. President, it is time to have some checks and balances in this country.
It's a direct showdown constitutionally between the president and Congress.
The latest clash is over secret Justice Department findings, authorizing the CIA to engage in the harshest interrogation techniques ever.
Mr. President, we are a democracy.
Frontline goes inside the efforts to rewrite the rules to enhance the power of the presidency. Tonight, Cheney's Law.
In Washington, there's so many people who will say, he's not the same man as I used to know.
And there's a lot of speculation among his friends. Did he change? Did I change? What happened here? Why do we see the world so differently when we once saw it so similarly?
Cheney is regarded as a pretty reasonable, even-handed, yes, conservative, but somebody you can work with. What people miss is that he's an absolute fanatic about executive power.
I, Richard Bruce Cheney, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So help me God. Congratulations, Mr. President.
Right around Inauguration Day, Dan Quayle went to see Dick Cheney, and he said, you know, Dick, you're going to be doing a lot of traveling, going to a lot of funerals, a lot of fundraisers. You're going to be doing the things that presidents don't want to do and that your president doesn't want to do. And Cheney just looked at him with that little half grin and raised his eyebrow and said, I have a different understanding with the president.
The understanding was that the vice president would be the central player in the new administration and do everything he could to enhance presidential power.
They came in spurred by Dick Cheney to have an enlarged sense of the presidency, to have a penchant for secrecy, to basically have a view that the Congress, in effect, works for us, not with us, that we're the lead branch, not a co-equal branch.
And from the beginning, the vice president set the style: secrecy.
Vice President Cheney is an extremely secretive public official. He himself doesn't write things down, doesn't use email, because he doesn't want to even raise the possibility his actions could someday be exposed, which would then constrain what he wants to do now.
Executive privilege was also at issue in the Vice President's Energy Task Force.
Through the years, Cheney's penchant for secrecy would cloak bold assertions of executive power and broad claims of executive privilege in an ongoing war with Congress. Cheney had learned some hard lessons early in his political career. He has been watching presidents for 3 decades. It began at the end of the Nixon administration. 33-year-old Dick Cheney saw it firsthand.
He viewed the searing moments of the Nixon administration, which he was there in the front seats for, as a diminution of what the president ought to be.
Then in 1975, he became President Ford's chief of staff.
Dick Cheney was then about in his mid-30s. For the first time in his life, really having a substantial amount of power and responsibility.
Subcommittee will come to order and council.
Cheney watched Congress assert its authority over the president.
You have a wave of congressional investigations.
The program certainly appears to violate the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution.
And Cheney is trying to fight off these investigations.
He's talked about how Congress unduly burdened the president and in a way that he believed was unconstitutional.
I believe that that's the way the
And Dick came out of that absolutely committed to the idea of restoring the powers of the presidency.
Then, in the 1980s, Cheney went to Congress.
We have a bit of a tendency in the Congress to act as if we're the fount of all political virtue in this society, and obviously we're not.
He found himself surrounded by Democrats, determined to limit Ronald Reagan's powers.
There's a certain amount of ambivalence to all of these proceedings.
Cheney said Reagan didn't need Congress's approval to fund the Contras through a back door.
I think it was perfectly acceptable for the president to encourage the cause of the Contras.
At that time, Cheney met David Addington, one of the few staff lawyers who shared his views on executive power.
David Addington is an extremely intelligent, extremely forceful individual.
He first entered the government in, I believe, the late 70s when he worked as a lawyer in the CIA.
He has very firmly held views and very well-grounded views on a lot of issues.
You know, Cheney is not a lawyer, so what he finds in Addington is someone who can argue it in a way that can hold sway in the room. I mean, he's got a lawyer now who can say it's constitutional, and so it becomes a very powerful duo at that point. And they stayed together ever since.
Together, Cheney and Addington brought their ideas to the Defense Department in the first Bush administration.
Will not stand this aggression against Kuwait.
As Secretary of Defense, Cheney argued the president should not seek congressional authorization for the Gulf War.
And the leadership in Congress generally was telling the first President Bush, you have to get permission from Congress to go into the Gulf War. The president didn't think that was the case. He resisted it.
I argued that we did not need congressional authorization, and that legally and from a constitutional standpoint we had all the authority we needed.
Secretary of Defense Cheney's advice was that it was unnecessary and imprudent. Unnecessary because the Constitution did not require it, imprudent because Congress might say no.
If we'd lost the vote in the Congress, I would certainly have recommended to the president that we go forward anyway.
In the end, Cheney's view did not prevail. The president agreed to a congressional vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 47.
As the first Bush administration ended, Cheney and Addington headed to the private sector. They waited for a future president, one more receptive to their ideas.
David Addington, Dick Cheney are true believers in what they're saying. They not only believe that the president has these powers, that the president has effectively unlimited powers as commander-in-chief, but that he has to, that if he doesn't, that this country will be at grave risk.
I believe you're looking at the next Vice President of the United States.
8 years later, Dick Cheney found a willing partner.
I think it's something the president's bought into. Did Cheney help to persuade him? Absolutely. But is the president now persuaded? Absolutely. And I think he's now a devotee of expanded executive power.
The new president brought some of his own people to the task. One of them was his top lawyer, Alberto Gonzales.
Bush calls him Fredo. He's intensely loyal. He was a justice on the Texas courts. He'd actually ruled favorably on several important cases for Bush.
They all like him. He's the judge. Yeah, they call him the judge inside the White House. Nice fella. But he's not exactly a heavyweight.
Gonzales had virtually no experience in matters of constitutional law, executive power, or national security. But David Addington did, and he was the vice president's lawyer.
David Addington was someone who had experience in all of the matters that Gonzales